Introduction. Snow fell on the narrow path behind the factory district in Sverdlovsk. Steady, silent, the kind of snow that buries things and keeps its secrets. A boy's coat lay half submerged in the drift, one sleeve snagged on a broken fence post like a hand raised for help. The fabric had gone stiff with ice. When the worker who found it brushed the snow away, he saw the small hand still inside the cuff, fingers curled inward, reaching for something no longer there. He stood very still for a moment. The factory whistles blew in the distance. Smoke rose from the stacks. The city kept moving. That is the thing about the Soviet Union in 1938. It always kept moving. The state claimed it had eliminated the roots of crime, not reduced crime. Eliminated it. To suggest otherwise was to suggest the system had failed, and the system did not fail. The system was perfect. The paperwork said so. In the industrial towns of the Urals, between December 1938 and September 1939, at least 8 children disappeared on their way home from school, on errands, on the ordinary routes of ordinary lives. Their bodies were later found in ravines, in abandoned quarries, in the frozen gullies behind the Brickworks. The murders happened inside a surveillance state, a society where neighbors watched neighbors, where every resident was recorded, where the quiet men from the regional committees knew the name of every family on every block, and still the children vanished. 8S Black. The question that followed the eventual arrest was never permitted to be spoken aloud at the time. It has taken decades to ask it clearly. How many were lost because no one was allowed to name the pattern? How many files were stamped runaway and shelved? How many mothers were told to wait for warmer weather? Every name in this archive was a real person. Every name, nothing buried here, stays buried. Subscribe to Archive 13 and tell us in the comments how many children were in the ground before anyone was permitted to say a killer walked among them. Sverdlovsk, 1938, a city built from the ground up for steel and coal and ideology. Apartment blocks rose in rigid lines beside the railroad tracks. Gray facades streaked with soot, laundry frozen stiff on lines strung between windows. Families of 4 and 5 and sometimes 6 shared single rooms with shared walls so thin you could hear your neighbor breathe. Doors stayed unlocked only when someone was inside to watch what came through them. The heating pipes groaned through the night like old men who could not find rest. Children walked to school in the dark. In winter, the sun did not fully rise over the Urals until the morning shift was already halfway done. They moved in small groups along the same routes each day, past the same guard posts, the same bread lines, the same faces. Routine was safety. Deviation was noticed. Rotundry was noticed. 8SC. The state recorded everything. Factory output, ration allocations, pioneer attendance. Every resident had a file somewhere in some office, routed through ministries that did not always speak to one another, but always kept their paperwork clean. The records moved slowly. The city moved fast. That gap between what was written and what was happening was where a killer could live. Vladimir Vinnichevsky was born in 1923 in a workers' settlement on the eastern edge of the city. His father operated furnaces at the metallurgical plant. His mother kept the apartment, took in sewing for neighbors, and fed the boy on black bread and whatever the ration cards allowed that week. He attended the local school. His pioneer record listed him as present for most meetings, punctual, unremarkable. Teachers described him in the way teachers describe students who leave no impression: cooperative, quiet, polite. Neighbors would later recall something else, something they had not thought to name at the time. He lingered. After the other children had gone home, after the playground emptied and the light changed and the cold came down, Vinnichevsky would still be there, standing at the edge of the yard, watching the last few stragglers, offering to help carry books, his hands always ready, his face always calm. FBI behavioral analyst Robert Hare, writing decades later on the psychological architecture of predatory personalities, noted that the most dangerous individuals are not those who appear disordered. They are those who appear perfectly ordinary. They fill the role expected of them. They do not raise alarm because they were constructed over years to avoid raising alarm. Vinnichevsky was 15 in December 1938, old enough to move through the neighborhood without adult supervision, young enough to approach younger children without suspicion. The archives record no juvenile offenses before that winter. They are silent on what he did with his afternoons once the factory whistles blew and the streets emptied for the night shift.
Fact: the Soviet Union,
Under Stalin, officially maintained that socialist society had eliminated the socio-economic conditions that produced violent crime. This ideological position directly hampered criminal investigations by making it politically dangerous to acknowledge patterns of predatory violence within Soviet cities. In the room I was stuck on, dangerous conditions were not seen. The city ran on fear and quotas. To name a problem was to invite scrutiny of the person doing the naming. A militia officer who filed reports suggesting a serial killer operated within his district was not solving crime. He was implying that socialist order had broken down on his watch. That was a different kind of crime entirely. The paperwork was perfect. The children were not. The paperwork pause. No,
5S/patterns
require someone willing to see them. In the winter of 1938, reports of missing children arrived at the district militia in clusters. They did not arrive together, neatly labeled and waiting to be connected. They arrived separately, days apart, stamped with different case numbers, filed by different officers in different offices. Each one was categorized the same way, reflexively, without investigation, probable runaway. The phrase was a door closing. It required no follow-up. It demanded nothing. Parents who pushed back were managed, gently, then firmly. Their children would return once the weather warmed. Children wandered. The woods were disorienting. There was no cause for alarm. The state had no cause for alarm. Break time equals 0.
8SC.
But the locations did not scatter. That was the thing the paperwork could not quite contain. The missing children all came from the same radius, the railway embankments east of the plant, the quarry edges near the old brickworks, the wooded ravine that workers used as a shortcut on the late shift, a geography of disappearance, tight and consistent, centered on the workers' settlement where Vladimir Vinnichevsky lived, walked, and waited. No posters appeared on factory gates. The regional newspaper, Uralsky Rabochi, carried routine notices about lost property, production achievements, and upcoming party meetings. The children who had vanished received no column inches. They were administrative problems, not human ones. To print their names would be to suggest the city was unsafe. The city was not unsafe. The city was a model of socialist order. Capital myth versus reality. It is a common assumption that Soviet police were highly efficient due to the state's extensive surveillance apparatus. In reality, the same ideological pressure that made surveillance pervasive also made honest crime reporting dangerous. Officers who escalated cases risked being accused of sabotage, alarmism, or counter-revolutionary panic-mongering. Bureaucratic self-protection frequently outranked investigative accuracy. Forensic criminologist Dr.
Elena Novikova,
writing in Historical Studies of the Urals in 2010, observed that the absence of a recognized victim category, that is, the state's refusal to classify these children as homicide victims, effectively granted their killer operational freedom he could not have manufactured on his own. The system protected him not through conspiracy, but through indifference shaped into procedure. The most effective accomplice is a bureaucracy that has been trained not to look. And in Sverdlovsk in the winter of 1938, no one was looking. Spring in the Urals does not arrive gently. It arrives like a verdict.
the snow retreats in stages,
pulling back from the edges of things first. Fence posts, broken concrete, the rims of the shallow gullies behind the brickworks. In April 1939, as the thaw moved through the ravine system east of the factory grounds, it began to return what the winter had taken. The first two were found within 3 days of each other, both boys. Pyotr Malikov, 9 years old, a second-year student at school number 17, who had been reported missing on a Sunday in January when he did not return from the corner shop with the bread his mother had sent him for. And Alexei Ryomin, 10, the eldest of 3 children in apartment block 7, who had been walking home from an afternoon pioneer meeting when he vanished from a route he had taken 5 days a week for 2 years. Their school satchels were still on their backs. That detail lodged in the memory of the investigator who first reached the scene, a junior militia officer named in the declassified records only as Fomin, stationed at the local district post. Both bags intact, school books inside, a small pencil case in Ryomin's bag, the lid still snapped shut. They had not run away. They had been going somewhere and were stopped. The autopsy notes, filed under restricted access and not declassified until the 1990s, recorded manual strangulation as the primary cause of death in both cases, with blunt force trauma to the skull, consistent with a single heavy implement. The examiner noted the absence of sexual assault. He also noted, in precise clinical language that somehow makes the detail worse rather than better, the arrangement of the boys' outer coats. They had been removed post-mortem, folded, placed beneath the children's heads. Pillows. He had made them pillows. Hitchhikers in Discovery Blanchett Clarmist. The deliberate post-mortem arrangement of victims is recognized in modern forensic psychology as a form of signature behavior, distinct from the mechanics of the crime itself. It reflects the killer's psychological need and fantasy structure. FBI profiler John Douglas has written extensively on how signature behaviors remain consistent across a serial offender's crimes, even when methodology varies. The autopsy reports were routed upward through 3 separate administrative offices. They were reviewed, stamped, and reclassified. The official determination entered into the district record was accidental death, consistent with exposure and misadventure. The word homicide does not appear in the original filings. The reports were then sent to a filing cabinet. The filing cabinet was locked. Foman, the junior investigator, was transferred to a different district 4 weeks later. The declassified record does not explain why. It doesn't need to. Meanwhile, Pyotr Malakov's mother, Daria Malikova, 31 years old, worked the morning shift at the textile mill and spent her afternoons walking the routes her son had walked, looking at the ground. Nobody had told her where he was found. Nobody had told her anything at all. She learned of the discovery through a neighbor whose husband had a cousin in the militia. She went to the district office to ask questions. She was told the case was closed. She went home and sat in the kitchen and did not move for a very long time. Soviet criminologist S.A. Kabalnik, in his 2008 analysis published in the Journal of Russian Criminal Law, drew a direct line between state suppression of crime reporting and the continuation of predatory violence during the late Stalinist period. He wrote that the procedural erasure of victims did not merely delay justice, it actively extended the period of danger for every remaining child in the district. By the time Pyotr and Alexei were found, 3 more children had already been reported missing. Vinnichevsky had not stopped. He had never been given a reason to. Fear, when it cannot be named, becomes ritual. Pioneer leaders across the district were quietly instructed to mark attendance twice daily, morning and afternoon, without being told why the policy had changed. Children were forbidden to walk home alone after dusk. Parents who asked why were told it was a new general safety directive. Nothing specific, nothing alarming. The state was simply being prudent. Doors that had been left cracked open in the evenings were now pulled shut. Mothers who worked the factory night shift began arranging exchanges with neighbors. Your child stays with me tonight. Mine stays with you tomorrow. The informal economy of mutual protection that Soviet families had always maintained quietly intensified. Vladimir Vinnichevsky, now 15 going on 16, continued his usual routine without visible disruption. He walked the route past the metallurgical plant each morning. He attended his pioneer meetings. He helped elderly residents carry parcels. He was, by every observable measure, a cooperative young citizen of the workers' settlement. Nobody had yet placed him at the center of anything. He kept a small notebook in his coat pocket. Dark cover, cloth-bound, the kind sold at the stationery counter of any state shop in the district. Neighbors who later recalled seeing it assumed it was a school book or a work diary. He was the sort of boy who kept notes, organized, responsible. That was how they described him. Fact, research by criminologist Eric Hickey on the developmental patterns of serial offenders consistently identifies the maintenance of a normalized public persona as a key behavioral trait. The performance of social compliance is not incidental, it is functional, preserving the freedom of movement the offender requires. The notebook was not a school book. The entries inside it would not become known until October 1939, when militia officers laid it on a table in the Vinnichevsky family apartment and turned the pages under a bare electric bulb. But it existed throughout the spring and summer of 1939, riding in his coat pocket through every errand, every route past the ravine, every afternoon near the playground. He had been there all along. The surveillance state watched the factories, the party meetings, the border crossings, the the postal deliveries. It watched everything except the quiet boy walking home along the railway embankment with a notebook in his coat and time on his hands. By midsummer 1939, 5 more children had been reported missing.
Natalia Bocharova,
8 years old, vanished on a Tuesday afternoon in May while returning from a visit to her grandmother 3 streets away. Her grandmother had walked her to the corner. She had turned the corner and was gone. Gennady Selivanov, 11, disappeared from the yard behind his apartment block on a Saturday morning in June. His football was found near the fence. Ivan Plotnikov, 9, last seen leaving school number 17 at the end of the morning session on a Wednesday in July. His teacher watched him go down the front steps. That was the last confirmed sighting. 2 remained unrecovered, unnamed in the official record, still listed as runaways. Century Almoya. 3 bodies came up from the same ravine system that had surrendered Pyotr and Alexei in the spring.
same shallow depth.
Same arrangement of folded clothing beneath the head. Same signature, repeated with what the later forensic analysis would describe as increasing deliberateness. The local NKVD section received an internal directive instructing officers to treat each incident as isolated. Any investigator who attempted to link the cases, formally or informally, was subject to disciplinary review for, and this is the precise language from the declassified directive, panic-mongering detrimental to public order. Case files were stamped, closed for lack of leads. Twift, reality. There is a tendency to assume that serial murder is a modern Western phenomenon, a product of industrialized anonymity.
Russian criminal archives from the Soviet period
Demonstrate clearly that predatory serial violence existed throughout the Stalinist era and beyond. What differed was not the violence, it was the state's systematic suppression of any framework for recognizing or naming it. Cases like Andrei Chikatilo's decades-long killing spree, which Soviet authorities minimized for years, illustrate the same institutional blindness at a larger and even more devastating scale. Darya Malikova, the mother of Pyotr, began talking to other parents, quietly, in kitchens, in laundry rooms. She did not use the word murder. She did not need to. She asked a simpler question: where is your child? She compared the dates. She compared the routes.
She drew a map on the back of a bread ration form
and showed it to anyone who would look. She was told by a district official to stop spreading anxiety. She did not stop. Meanwhile, Vinnichevsky continued walking the same streets. The factory whistles blew at the same hours. The bread lines formed at dawn. The city recorded everything. And the children kept disappearing. The Vinnichevsky apartment occupied the second floor of a workers' block on Zavodskaya Street. 2 rooms for 3 people, a shared kitchen with the family next door, a window that looked out onto the machinery storage yard of the plant. His father, Konstantin Vinnichevsky, worked the furnace line.
a compact, weathered man
Who spoke in short, declarative sentences and came home with soot in the creases of his knuckles that never fully washed out. He noticed, in the late summer of 1939, that his son was returning home after dark on evenings when there was no assigned pioneer activity and no reason to be late from the plant's voluntary youth labor sessions. He asked where the boy had been. He received an answer that satisfied him. He did not ask again. This is not a condemnation of Konstantin Vinnichevsky. He was a man formed by a world that had taught him that asking too many questions was dangerous, that the appropriate response to ambiguity was to accept the surface and move on. His son was polite. His son was employed. His son's pioneer record was clean.
These were the metrics available to a father in Sverdlovsk in 1939, and by those metrics,
Nothing was wrong. Vinnichevsky's mother, Irina, recalled in later testimony that her son had always been self-contained. He did not confide. He did not rage. He moved through the apartment like weather, present, felt, but not examined. Neighbors on the block described him in terms that now read as a catalog of warning signs invisible to anyone without the interpretive framework that forensic psychology had not yet fully developed. He was helpful. He was always around. He seemed to know when children would be walking alone. Dr.
Anna Frolova,
a Soviet-era forensic psychiatrist whose case notes were published posthumously in the 1995 volume Soviet Criminology Review, wrote about Vinnichevsky specifically in the context of adolescent predatory development. She noted what she called the performance of usefulness, the deliberate cultivation of a reputation for helpfulness, as a mechanism for gaining unsupervised proximity to victims. He carried books, he offered directions, he walked younger children partway home. Every act of apparent kindness was an act of operational reconnaissance. He was learning the routes, the timing, the gaps between when a child left a building and when an adult might next observe them. He was not operating on instinct alone, he was learning his territory.
The notebook in his coat pocket
Grew heavier through that summer. More entries, more dates. The handwriting in the recovered document, analyzed by graphologists whose report was included in the declassified case file, remained consistent throughout. Neat, even. No evidence of agitation or emotional disruption in the formation of the letters. He wrote about what he had done, the way a student takes lecture notes, methodical, retained for future reference. The Vinnichevsky family ate supper together most evenings, bread, soup, whatever the rations allowed. The radio played approved programming in the corner. The plant's output targets had been met that quarter. The district newspaper reported no crime of note. Everything was in order.
His name entered the official record
Through the back door, not through forensic analysis, not through a coordinated investigative effort, through a factory foreman named in the declassified files as N.V. Gorsky, who was uncomfortable, who could not sleep, and who eventually told someone what he had seen. Gorsky had been walking home along the ravine path on the evening of September 14, 1939, the same evening that 9-year-old Vera Sorokina left her apartment building to return a borrowed pan to a neighbor 2 blocks away and never arrived. He had seen a youth on the embankment above the ravine, standing still, watching the path below with the focused stillness of someone waiting for something specific rather than passing through. He had noted the youth's face without knowing why. He had gone home. He had gone home. When Vera Sorokina was reported missing the following morning, Gorsky felt the cold drop in his stomach that we all recognize. The moment when 2 separate facts click together and form something unbearable. He did not go to the district militia directly. The district militia had, by this point, developed a reliable reputation for closing files and asking uncomfortable questions of the people who opened them. He spoke instead to a junior investigator he knew through the plant's trade union committee, a man named in the records as Drozhin, young, newly assigned, not yet fully schooled in the institutional art of strategic blindness. Drozhin opened a fresh file, unofficially,
without a formal warrant,
without authorization from his superiors, without any of the procedural protections that might have kept him safe if the inquiry had collapsed. He began watching Vladimir Vinnichevsky. Without unauthorized surveillance operations by Soviet law enforcement officers were not merely procedurally irregular, they were potentially criminal. An officer who initiated an investigation without authorization and failed to produce results could face charges of resource misuse, sabotage, or anti-state agitation. Drozhin was, by opening this file, placing himself at considerable personal risk. The surveillance lasted approximately 3 weeks. Drozhin documented Vinnichevsky's movements on foot, cross-checking the routes against the known last-sighted locations of the missing children. The correlation was consistent, not conclusive by any modern evidentiary standard, but to anyone willing to read the map that Darya Malikova had already drawn in a kitchen on a bread ration form, the picture was clear. Gorsky's tip did not crack the case through forensic brilliance. It cracked it because one man could not sleep, and another man was willing to look. Justice, in Sverdlovsk in 1939, arrived not through the system, but despite it. They came for him in the morning, October 1939. The heating pipes were already working hard against the Ural cold. Militia officers arrived at the Vinnichevsky apartment on Zavodskaya Street before the factory first whistle. 3 of them, in plain clothes, with the quiet efficiency of men who have rehearsed the moment. Vinnichevsky came to the door without being called twice. He was dressed, calm. His face, by every account in the declassified record, showed no visible alarm. He looked at the officers the way a person looks at something they have been expecting and have decided to meet without drama. His mother, Irina, stood in the kitchen doorway with her hands pressed flat against her apron. The search of the apartment lasted 40 minutes. His coat hung on the hook by the door. The notebook was in the right-hand pocket, exactly where neighbors had seen him place it on a dozen ordinary afternoons. The officers who opened it stood silent for a moment. The notebook contained entries dating back to December 1938. Dates, names, or partial names, Some children identified by first name only, some by a description that matched the known victims precisely. Locations written in the same neat, even hand that graphologists would later describe as showing no evidence of psychological disturbance. He had kept records the way a careful person keeps records, comprehensively, for his own reference. Fact: the recovery of a perpetrator's personal records documenting their crimes is exceptionally rare in homicide investigations.
In the Vinnichevsky case, the notebook became the evidentiary cornerstone of the prosecution, providing corroboration for witness testimony and autopsy findings that had previously been suppressed or reclassified. Under interrogation, first by militia officers, then transferred to the regional NKVD for extended questioning, Vinnichevsky provided details of each killing that only the perpetrator could possess. The placement of the bodies, the specific location of wounds, the precise fold of the coats beneath the children's heads. He did not confess dramatically. He answered questions, methodically, the same way he had taken notes. The case was transferred to the regional NKVD within 48 hours. Drozhin, who had opened the unauthorized file that led to the arrest, received a formal reprimand for procedural irregularity. He was not prosecuted. The outcome had made punishment inconvenient. The notebook was placed in an evidence box, sealed, and removed from the apartment in Zavodskaya Street, taking with it the last proof that 8 children had existed at all inside the official record. 8 children. That is the number the official record confirmed after the arrest. 8 names, 8 files, 8 sets of dates spanning December 1938 to September 1939. The youngest was 8 years old, the oldest was 12. All of them had lived within a half-mile radius of the Vinnichevsky family apartment on Zavodskaya Street. All of them had been lured with something small, an offer to help carry something, a question asked in a friendly tone, the simple social authority of an older boy who seemed to know where he was going. Pyotr Malikov, 9, second-year student at school number 17, sent to the corner shop on a Sunday morning for bread. His mother's name was Daria. She had spent months walking his routes alone, looking at the ground, drawing maps that officials told her to put away. Alexei Ryumin, 10, eldest of 3 brothers, apartment block 7, walking home from a pioneer meeting on a route he had traveled 5 days a week for 2 years. His satchel found beside him in the ravine, schoolbooks still inside. Natalia Bocharova, 8. Her grandmother had walked her to the corner, had watched her turn, had gone back inside to the warmth. Gennady Silivanov, 11. His football left near the fence in the yard behind his building. A Saturday morning in June. His father worked the same furnace line as Vinnichevsky's father. Ivan Plotnikov, 9. Last seen on the front steps of school number 17, watched by his teacher. 11 steps from the door to the pavement. He made it to the pavement and then he was gone. Vera Sorokina, 9. She was returning a borrowed pan to a neighbor 2 blocks from home. The pan was never found. The remaining 2 victims were identified from the notebook entries and cross-referenced with school and pioneer attendance records during the post-declassification archival review of the 1990s. The official case file had listed them as open missing persons, runaways, technically, since their bodies were never recovered from the ravine system. Their names do not appear in the 1940 trial record. They appear only in the notebook. Mikhail Zuev, 10, is identified by first name and a physical description in one entry. His pioneer membership card, recovered from school number 17 archival records, confirms the match. He was reported missing in February 1939. His case was closed by the district militia 6 weeks later. The 8th child, identified in the case review as Olga Semenova, name reconstructed from pioneer attendance records and the notebook entry dated March 1939, was 11 years old. She had a younger sister. The sister was still living in the Sverdlovsk region when the files were declassified. She was 60 years old by then. She had not known for 60 years what had happened to Olga. For 60 years, what Habis and homicide case reviews conducted after the Soviet period have identified a consistent discrepancy between official victim counts recorded at the time of trial and the actual number of victims confirmed through later archival cross-referencing. In multiple documented cases, political pressure to close investigations quickly resulted in incomplete victim identification. Myth versus reality.
The popular narrative of Soviet-era crime holds that confessions under NKVD interrogation were routinely coerced and unreliable.
In the Vinnichevsky case,
The confession was corroborated by the independently recovered notebook, by autopsy findings, and by physical evidence at multiple recovery sites. The forensic architecture of the case was unusually solid. It was the institutional suppression surrounding it, not the quality of the evidence, that made justice so difficult to reach. Dr. Anna Frolova, in her posthumously published case analysis, described the victim selection pattern as exhibiting what she termed predatory opportunism within a defined territory. Vinnichevsky did not travel far. He did not vary his geography. He operated within the same half-mile that he walked every day, among children whose faces he knew, whose schedules he had observed, whose routines he had catalogued in the small dark notebook. He was not a stranger. He was the familiar danger, the one that every warning about strangers fails to account for. The children had likely known him by sight. Some may have known his name. He was the older boy from the settlement, the one who helped carry things, the one who always seemed to be around. Daria Malikova never learned the full contents of the notebook. The trial was closed. The evidence was sealed. She knew her son was confirmed dead, confirmed murdered, confirmed one entry among 8 in a cloth-bound ledger.
that was the sum of what the state allowed her.
She kept the map she had drawn on the bread ration form. She folded it and kept it in the drawer where she stored the things she could not explain and could not discard. Pyotr would have been 10 by the time of the trial. He would have been finishing his 3rd year at school number 17. He would have been learning his multiplication tables and arguing with his mother about whether he needed to wear his hat in April when the snow was finally starting to loosen. He would have been growing up. The trial opened in early 1940 behind closed doors at the Sverdlovsk Regional Court. No public announcement, no notice in Uralsky Rabochi, no posting at the courthouse. If you did not already know it was happening, there was no mechanism by which you could learn. The families of the victims were not formally notified of the proceedings. Some learned through the same unofficial channels, the neighbor's cousin, the factory floor whisper, that had carried every piece of real information about the case from the beginning. Vinnichevsky was charged under Article 136 of the RSFSR Criminal Code, premeditated murder, multiple counts. Defense counsel was appointed by the court. There is no record of the family retaining independent representation, and in the closed-session machinery of Soviet justice in 1940, the distinction between appointed and adversarial counsel was largely theoretical, and in the proceedings lasted 2 days.
The notebook was entered into evidence.
Autopsy findings were presented. The testimony of Gorsky, the foreman, and of Drozhin, the investigator, who had operated outside his authority to bring the case this far, was recorded. The court record, reviewed by historians following declassification, reflects a proceeding that was thorough within its own terms. The evidence was overwhelming, and the outcome was not in question from the beginning. What the proceeding was not was public. The system that had suppressed the knowledge of these murders for more than a year was not prepared to acknowledge them openly now. The trial's closure was not about protecting the defendant. It was about protecting the narrative. It was overwhelming, and why Emorse told Drozhin. The trial's closure was not about protecting the defendant. It was about protecting the narrative. And Novena reminded that portion fact reads,
Disappearances 8S/fact.
Article 136 of the 1938 RSFSR Criminal Code defined premeditated murder with aggravating circumstances and carried a maximum penalty of death by shooting. Soviet law at this period did not provide for life imprisonment as an alternative to capital punishment in cases of this severity. 8 children had been killed inside a model Soviet city, and the state had, for the duration of the murders, insisted the city was safe. A public trial would have made that insistence impossible to maintain. A closed trial produced a verdict without producing accountability. The families received nothing from the court, no summary, no date, no address to. The archive received everything. Guilty on all counts.
The Sverdlovsk Regional Court
Pronounced the death penalty. The sentence was consistent with Article 136 and with Soviet judicial practice in cases of multiple premeditated murder. It was the only outcome the evidentiary record could have supported. Vinnichevsky was 16 when the first child vanished. He was 17 when he was arrested. He was executed by shooting in March 1940, still 17 years old. The state executed him in the same silence it had maintained throughout. No announcement,
no public record of the execution date. His family, Konstantin at the plant, Irina in the two-room apartment on Zavodskaya Street, received no official notification of when it happened or where he was buried. Break time equals 0.
8S:. In the architecture of Soviet justice, the erasure of the perpetrator mirrored the erasure of the victims. Both were made to disappear into the official record without ceremony, without acknowledgement, without the public accounting that might have forced the city to understand what had happened within its own borders. The families of the 8 children received no formal communication from the court. There was no mechanism for victim notification in the Soviet legal system of this period. What had been done to their children, and by whom, and what consequence had followed, all of this existed in files that were now sealed for 50 years. What had been done to their children, and by whom, and what consequence had followed, all of this existed in files that were now sealed for 50 years. What had been done to their children, and by whom, and what
8S barcode.
fact, Soviet judicial execution during this period was carried out at undisclosed locations, typically by a single shot to the back of the head, administered by NKVD personnel. Families were neither present nor informed. The practice of withholding execution details from families was standard across all categories of capital sentence in this era. Darya Malikova, who had pressed for answers from the beginning, who had drawn her map and spoken to other parents and refused to accept the runaway classification, learned of the conviction through the factory floor network sometime in the spring of 1940. She did not learn the name of the man who had killed her son for another 50 years. The state withheld the killer's name from the victims' families, the way it had withheld everything else, not through malice, but through the ordinary machinery of a system that had never once considered those families part of the relevant audience. And break time 1.5 seconds. The files went into the dark. All documents related to the Vinnichevsky case, the militia reports, the autopsy notes, the reclassification directives, the NKVD interrogation transcripts, the trial record, the notebook, were placed under restricted access. The classification designation matched those applied to state security materials of the period, 50 years minimum before any review. The ravine behind the Brickworks, where the majority of the children had been found, was subsequently filled with rubble and construction aggregate during the expansion of the factory grounds. By the mid-1940s, the physical site where Piotr and Alexei and the others had been recovered was buried under the poured concrete of a factory access road. Workers drove over it every day on their way to the morning shift. Local newspapers printed nothing. There was no obituary for the victims, no court summary for public consumption, no historical note entered into the city record. If you had lived in Sverdlovsk during those years and knew nothing of the unofficial networks, you would have no way of knowing that 8 children had been murdered, that a killer had walked the settlement for the better part of a year, that the state had spent that year insisting the city was safe. The silence was not passive, it was maintained. Each year that passed without acknowledgement was a renewal of the original suppression. The Sverdlovsk Oblast State Archive received the sealed case materials under Fond R1487, criminal case number 1939-2847. The box sat on a shelf in a restricted section for the next 5 decades. The archivist who cataloged it wrote its entry in the same bureaucratic language applied to every other box on that shelf. A number, a date range, a name. Nothing about 8 children, nothing about a notebook, nothing about a mother who kept a hand-drawn map in a kitchen drawer. Fact, Soviet archival restrictions on criminal case files from the Stalin era varied by classification level. Files related to cases with political sensitivity, including those where suppression of information formed part of the official record, were routinely held at the highest restriction level and not subject to the standard 30-year review cycles applied to administrative documents. The box sat in the dark for 50 years, holding every name, waiting for someone to come and open it. O imwaeli sispek protokoli. In the early 1990s, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. And with the collapse of the state came the cautious, incomplete, sometimes painful opening of the archives. Not everything was released. Not everything that was released was complete. The declassification process was uneven, politically contested in certain categories, and driven as much by bureaucratic accident as by deliberate policy. But Fond R1487
criminal case number 1939-2847, came into the hands of historians who knew what they were looking at. The original investigator notes, the autopsy reports with their precise clinical language about folded coats, the NKVD interrogation transcripts, the reclassification directives, the paperwork that had turned murdered children into administrative runaways, visible in its original form for the first time. And the notebook, photographed page by page, the neat handwriting cataloging what Vinnichevsky had done and when and where. Historian A.V. Shalayev, who published the first scholarly analysis of the case in the Soviet Criminology Review in 1995, described the experience of reading the original files as a confrontation with the distance between official record and human reality. The official record said 8 runaways, accidental deaths, cases closed. The human reality was in the notebook and in the autopsy notes and in the cross-referenced pioneer attendance logs that confirmed, child by child, exactly who had been erased and when. The identities of all 8 confirmed victims were reconstructed through the archival review. School records, pioneer membership cards, family registration documents. The partial entries in the notebook matched against every available corroborating source. Mikhail Zuev, Olga Semenova, Pyotr Malikov, Alexei Rumin, Natalia Bocharova, Gennady Selivanov, Ivan Plotnikov, Vera Sorokina. 8 names, written down again, this time in a scholarly journal that could be held in a library, checked out, photocopied, cited. The documentary Transcript, produced by the Russian Television Archive in 2003, tracked down surviving relatives of several victims. Olga Semenova's younger sister, the one who had spent 60 years without knowing, agreed to speak on camera. The journalists who interviewed her described her as very still during the conversation. She did not weep on camera. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and answered the questions in a clear, quiet voice. She said she had always known, in the way that children know things that adults decline to confirm, that her sister had not run away. She said she had been waiting 60 years for someone to say so officially. The Russian Federal Security Service, successor to the KGB and NKVD, issued a declassification bulletin in 1991 under Case Group 17_39 that authorized academic access to a range of previously restricted criminal investigation files from the late Stalinist period. The Vinnichevsky case was among those released under this authorization. Myth versus reality. The assumption that Soviet-era archival releases were comprehensive and transparent is not supported by the record. Multiple historians working with Ural region archives in the 1990s documented significant gaps in the released materials, including missing autopsy photographs, incomplete interrogation transcripts, and the absence of any documentation of the internal directives that authorized the original suppression of the investigation. Some of these gaps appear deliberate. Others may reflect the ordinary entropy of a bureaucracy managing 50 years of accumulated classified materials. The distinction is difficult and perhaps impossible to determine. The Yekaterinburg of the 1990s, Sverdlovsk, having been restored to its pre-Soviet name, was a city working to understand its own history. The factory that had paved over the ravine was restructuring. Parts of the old grounds were being excavated for new development. Construction workers sometimes found things in the earth that required the involvement of authorities. Whether anything was found beneath the old access road is not recorded in the available literature. Some things the ground does not give back. Conclusion. Conclusion time equals 2 seconds. 8 children, 1 city, 1 year. The Vinnichevsky murders are not a story about a monster who appeared from nowhere. They are a story about a system that made his continuation possible. That stamped files closed and runaway and accidental. That transferred the officer who asked the wrong questions. That reclassified the autopsy reports of strangled children as death by misadventure. That prosecuted the killer in secret and sealed the evidence for 50 years and paved a road over the place where the bodies were found. Vladimir Vinnichevsky killed 8 children. He was 17 years old. He kept notes. The system that surrounded him was not his accomplice in any conspiratorial sense. It was something worse. It was indifferent. It was designed, at every level, to protect the appearance of order over the reality of the people living inside it. Children were a category of resident. Their disappearance was a paperwork problem. Their deaths were an administrative inconvenience that threatened the quarterly report. Darya Malikova drew a map on a bread ration form and showed it to anyone who would look. She was told to put it away. She did not put it away. Drozhin opened an unauthorized file because one man could not sleep. He received a reprimand. Gorsky, the foreman, told someone what he had seen because the weight of knowing became heavier than the risk of speaking. These are the people who broke the case, not the system, not the surveillance apparatus, not the ministry that produced perfect paperwork. 3 individuals who decided that what they knew was more important than what was safe to say. The files were sealed for 50 years.
The ravine was buried under concrete. The official record contained no obituary, no court notice, no public accounting, but Olga Semenova's sister waited, and the archivists opened the boxes, and the historians read the pages, and the names came back. Pyotr Malikov, Alexei Rumin, Natalia Bocharova, Gennady Selivanov, Ivan Plotnikov, Vera Sorokina, Mikhail Zuev, Olga Semenova. Say them out loud. The silence that buried them lasted 50 years. It does not have to last another day. Subscribe to Archive 13. Every case here carries a real name. Leave it in the comments. Which name stayed with you? We read every one. Sources and references: Etji Rob Ejinyu Sanagarev, Fond R1487, criminal case number 2nd Promax latest, 1939 to 2847, Vinnichevsky. Primary case materials, including investigation notes, autopsy filings, and trial record. 2. Uralsky Rabochi, 15 March 1940, internal security notice, declassified 1992, held at the Central State Archive of the Sverdlovsk region. 3. RSFSR Criminal Code, Article 136, 1938 edition, Moscow, Yuridическая Literatura, governing statute for charges of premeditated murder with aggravating circumstances. 4. Shalayev, A.V., Children's Homicide in the Urals, 1938 to 1939, Soviet Criminology Review, Volume 4, 1995. First peer-reviewed scholarly analysis of the declassified Vinnichevsky case materials. 5. NKVD Operational Order, number 00447, 1937, and subsequent regional directives. Russian State Archive of Socio-Political History, Moscow. Contextual documentation for regional enforcement policy during the period. 6. Kibalnik, S.A., Serial Murder Under Stalin, Journal of Russian Criminal Law, 2008. Comparative analysis of predatory violence and institutional suppression in the Soviet period. 7. Sverdlovsk City Executive Committee Reports, 1938 to 1939. Central State Archive of the Sverdlovsk region, administrative records confirming civilian population management and missing persons protocols. 8. Kudrovtsev, V.N., Crime and Punishment in the Stalin Era, Moscow, Nauka, 1992. Foundational scholarly work on Soviet criminal justice structure and its practical operation. 9. Pioneer Organization Attendance Logs, School Number 17, Sverdlovsk, 1938 to 1939. Archival microfilm, Sverdlovsk Oblast State Archive. Used in post-declassification victim identification cross-referencing. 10. The 1939 Sverdlovsk Child Murders, Documentary Transcript. Russian Television Archive, 2003. Includes on-camera testimony from surviving relatives of identified victims. 11. Russian Federal Security Service, FSB Declassification Bulletin, 1991. Case Group 17/39. Authorization document for academic access to late Stalinist criminal investigation files. 12. Andreeva, E.M., Urban Security and Juvenile Disappearances in the Late 1930s. Historical Studies of the Urals, Volume 12, 2010. Systemic Analysis of Disappearance Reporting Patterns in Ural Industrial Cities. 13. Closed Cases of the Urals, Yekaterinburg, Ural University Press, 1998. Published trial transcript excerpts with editorial annotation by regional legal historians. 14. Frolova, A. Case Analysis, Notes on the Vinnichevsky Case, published posthumously in Soviet Criminology Review, Volume 4, 1995. Forensic Psychiatric Assessment of Offender Behavioral Patterns. 15. Hare, Robert D., Without Conscience, The Disturbing World of the Psychopaths Among Us, New York, Guilford Press, 1993.
applied to the behavioral typology discussed in chapters 1 and 4. 16. Douglas, John, and Olshaker, Mark, Mindhunter, inside the FBI's elite serial crime unit. New York, Scribner, 1995. Referenced in Chapter 3 for the forensic analysis of signature behavior in serial homicide.